The woods of West Virginia are older than memory, older than the sins that have taken root beneath their soil. When the wind moves through the trees, it carries a sound that doesn't belong to nature, a low, aching whisper that feels too human to be wind. They say there was once a man who built a home here, a man who wanted to keep his blood pure, no matter the cost. His children were his pride, his descendants his possession. What began as a family became a prison, and what was meant to preserve life turned into something that defied nature itself. No one in the nearby towns ever saw the family come to church or market. No births were recorded. No deaths were mourned. They simply existed, hidden, breeding in the shadow of the same rotten walls, their faces growing more unfamiliar with each generation. Years later, when the forest shifted and time peeled back its layers, the truth began to crawl out, a truth that smelled of decay, old wood, and guilt soaked into the earth. Among the ruins of that cabin, searchers found a single oil lantern still standing on the table, glass cracked, wick blackened. And beneath it, the journal of a man who signed every page with a single line. The blood must stay within. Some say his descendants still wander those woods, not alive, not dead, cursed by a bloodline that refused to end. And if you listen closely on a quiet Appalachian night, you might still hear the sound of that old man whispering to his wives, calling them by the same name he once gave his daughters. The discovery came on a fog-drenched morning after a week of heavy rain had loosened the soil of the Appalachian slopes. A group of hikers, straying from the main trail in rural West Virginia, stumbled upon what looked like the jagged corner of an old roof poking through the mud. It was strange because there were no records of any settlements in that part of the forest. The land had been abandoned for generations, left to rot under layers of moss and fallen pine. When they dug away the dirt with sticks and boots, what emerged was not just a cabin, but a frozen moment from a forgotten century. The wood was blackened, not from fire but from time itself, warped and soft like wet paper. The air that escaped from inside carried a smell older than the forest, a mix of rot, rust, and something that made the skin crawl. When local authorities arrived, they expected to find the usual relics of Appalachian isolation, maybe an old hunter's shack or a miner's shelter, but what they found instead was something that defied any ordinary explanation. Inside the structure, which had been sealed shut by landslides and roots, the floorboards were buried under layers of dust and bones. There were jars lining the shelves, filled with what appeared to be preserved organs, labeled with names that matched no known records. A rusted cradle sat in one corner, its bottom darkened with stains that had long since dried. On the walls, faint carvings of initials and dates were visible, etched deep into the wood, some overlapping each other as if generations had marked their presence in the same cursed space. It wasn't until one of the deputies kicked aside a rotted plank that they uncovered the most chilling artifact, a small, leather-bound book wrapped in cloth and sealed with twine. The pages were water-damaged, but the writing was still legible, neat and deliberate, written in a tone that felt both authoritative and intimate. The first entry began in the early 1900s and referred to the writer as the Keeper of Blood. It spoke of a line that must not be diluted and wives of the same blood, phrases that hinted at something deeply unnatural. The words were not those of a madman rambling, but of someone documenting a tradition, a purpose. The investigators who read those lines would later describe an overwhelming sense of dread, not because of what they saw in the cabin, but because of what those words implied, that what began there might not have truly ended. The journal was unlike anything the investigators had ever seen. Its leather cover, darkened and cracked with age, seemed to breathe with the dampness of the forest air. Inside, the handwriting was neat but unsettlingly controlled, as though every word had been written with ritualistic precision. The ink, faded to a reddish brown, gave the impression of blood soaked into paper long ago. The author referred to himself not by a name, but by a title, the Keeper of Blood. Every page unfolded a deeper descent into a private world that had existed completely cut off from the outside. The entries began innocently enough, describing the isolation of mountain life, the difficulty of finding food, and the fear of outsiders. But slowly, the tone shifted into something darker, something that blurred faith, madness, and obsession. The man wrote of a belief passed down from his own father, that their bloodline was sacred, chosen, pure, and never meant to mix with the unworthy. He believed that to let the blood stray beyond the family would invite sickness and damnation. His words carried the authority of scripture, declaring that each union must be kept within the circle. What had once been moral guidance became justification for something monstrous. The journal detailed the first transgression, his own daughter, described as the vessel of continuation. He wrote about her not with tenderness, but with ownership, as though she were part of the land he had inherited. He spoke of her children as renewed flesh, a twisted way of saying the blood had been successfully preserved. As the investigators read deeper, they realized this wasn't just a diary, it was a record of lineage. Each entry documented births, unions, and deaths, carefully listed as though maintaining the log of a breeding experiment. Generations were reduced to numbers and traits, hair color, skin tone, health conditions, as though the writer had been monitoring his own descendants for signs of impurity. There were entries that described certain children as unfit, their names crossed out in thick ink with notes about removal. The journal did not say how those removals happened, but stains on certain pages hinted that they were not natural deaths. By the time the final pages were examined, one thing became horrifyingly clear: this was not the madness of one man, but the manifesto of a legacy. He had taught his children to believe the same, and their children after them. The journal was not a confession, it was instruction, a guide meant to be continued long after his death. The last line read, "When my eyes close, the blood shall keep watch." It wasn't signed with a name, only a handprint pressed into the paper, dark and brittle, like the mark of someone who never wanted to be forgotten. The first generation was where the horror truly began, the point at which belief turned into practice. According to the journal, the grandfather, now fully embodying the title of the Keeper of Blood, had become convinced that divine order demanded purity through isolation. He wrote that the outside world was diseased with corruption and sin, and that his family was chosen to remain untouched by it. What began as fear of contamination soon grew into an obsession, one that would consume not only him but every descendant born after. The earliest entries describe how, after his wife's death, he began to look inward for continuation, seeing his eldest daughter not as a child but as a vessel of the same blood that had to remain pure. He justified his actions as sacred, claiming that blood shared was blood strengthened. In the following pages, he detailed the night it happened, the night that would mark the beginning of West Virginia's most cursed lineage. The cabin, already isolated by miles of thick forest, became a place of rituals. He described it as the sanctum, a space where only those of his blood could enter, a place untainted by the eyes of outsiders. It was there that he performed his first act of what he called preservation. The language he used was calm, almost devotional, never acknowledging the horror of what he had done. The daughter was described as chosen, as if she were fulfilling some divine purpose, though the trembling tone of later entries hinted that she had not gone willingly. Months later, the journal spoke of her giving birth. The child was referred to as the first renewal, a term repeated through later generations. He recorded the infant's features, its pale eyes, frail limbs, and difficulty breathing, with fascination rather than concern. What should have been seen as deformity, he saw as proof that the blood remained unmixed and sacred. The other children of the family were forbidden to leave the cabin, raised with the belief that the outside world was dangerous and that only through the blood of their own could they remain safe. As years passed, the lines between family roles dissolved completely. He began arranging unions between siblings, cousins, and even between himself and younger descendants. By the time the journal reached the later pages of this period, the tone grew colder, more structured, as though the acts had become routine. Names appeared beside dates like records in a ledger, births, unions, deaths, all under the same hand. What had started as a man's madness had turned into a family system, an inherited curse disguised as faith. The first generation had been born not out of love or survival, but out of one man's belief that his blood was too sacred to ever mix with the world beyond his cabin walls. The disappearances began quietly, almost unnoticeable at first, like faint echoes swallowed by the hills. In those days, the small Appalachian towns of West Virginia were scattered and disconnected, and people could vanish without anyone asking too many questions. The locals told stories of strange lights flickering in the woods, of faint cries carried on the wind, but few were willing to venture far enough to see where they came from. It wasn't unusual for families living deep in the hollers to isolate themselves, especially during harsh winters when roads became impassable. But this family's silence was different. There were no visitors, no tradesman who ever delivered goods, and no one ever recalled seeing them in church or town. It was as if the forest itself had swallowed them whole and decided to keep them hidden. By the late 1920s, the first rumors began to spread. A young woman named Elsie Turner, who lived on the edge of the woods, disappeared after telling neighbors she had seen a man watching her from the tree line. Her mother claimed she heard someone calling Elsie's name at night in a slow, unfamiliar voice. When searchers combed the woods, they found only a piece of fabric caught on a thorn bush, darkened by mud and something else they couldn't identify. Not long after, a trapper vanished in the same region. His abandoned campsite was found near the same creek that ran past the cabin where the bloodline had begun. The sheriff at the time noted that every trace of him ended at the water, as though he had been dragged beneath it. Locals whispered that the family living up in those woods didn't want to be found. Hunters who strayed too close spoke of hearing footsteps following them, of laughter that sounded like children's voices coming from deep inside the trees. No one ever saw who it was, but everyone who returned spoke of the same uneasy feeling, the sense that they were being watched by people who did not belong to the living. Over time, the community stopped asking questions. They said that if the family wanted to stay hidden, it was best to let them. Those who tried to uncover their secrets had a habit of not returning. By the time the authorities finally investigated decades later, most of those who remembered the early disappearances were gone. Old maps didn't even mark the path to the cabin anymore. It was as if the forest had conspired with the family to erase every trace of their existence. Only the silence remained, and the stories told in whispers by those who claimed that, even now, when the fog is thick enough, you can still hear someone calling out a name that doesn't belong to anyone alive. The disease came quietly, creeping through the generations like a shadow that could not be outrun. It began with the children, those born from the forbidden unions that the old man called sacred. Their bodies were frail, their faces pale and uneven, their limbs twisted in ways that defied nature. At first, the grandfather wrote in his journal that the children were chosen, that their deformities were marks of purity, proof that their blood had not been corrupted by outsiders. But with each new generation, the symptoms worsened. Eyes clouded over before adolescence, joints failed to form properly, and strange lesions appeared on the skin as if the body itself was rejecting its lineage. The same bloodline he had sworn to preserve was now rotting from within. The nearby towns had always whispered about sickness in the mountains, but no one knew its true origin. When outsiders occasionally crossed paths with members of the family, they noticed a strange, distant look in their eyes, a blankness that seemed more than just fear. Their speech was slurred, their movements awkward, and their features so similar it was as if the same face had been copied and passed down again and again. Some believed it was a curse, others thought it was the price of isolation. But those who knew the old stories suspected something far more unnatural. They spoke of how the land itself had turned against the family, how the earth rejected them because their blood had betrayed nature's laws. By the mid-century, the disease had become inescapable. The descendants who survived were barely functional, many unable to walk or speak clearly. The journal mentioned a condition described as the inward turning, where bones bent inward over time, crushing the lungs and spine until the body could no longer support itself. The grandfather, who had once written with pride, began to write in panic. He begged their ancestors of the blood to lift what he believed was a test of faith. But his prayers went unanswered, and his descendants continued to wither, their lives short and filled with pain. The silence pact was not written, but it ruled every breath inside that cabin. After years of isolation and sickness, the grandfather understood that the only way his twisted bloodline could survive was through secrecy. The journal revealed how he gathered his family one night, when the oil lamp was the only source of light, and made them swear an oath that no one would ever speak of their lives beyond the trees. The words were not spoken as a choice but as a command. He called it the binding of tongues, a ritual meant to seal their loyalty and erase any thought of escape. Those who dared to break the vow would be marked as traitors, and the punishment for betrayal was written not in ink, but in blood. The pact ensured that generations after him would remain trapped in the same cycle of silence. The children were raised to believe the outside world was poison, that outsiders would kill them or force them to abandon the sacred line. Fear became their religion. The cabin, once a place of birth and sickness, turned into a shrine of obedience where no laughter, no prayer, and no truth were allowed to exist unless the grandfather permitted it. Even after his death, his words continued to control them, passed down through his descendants as commandments that could never be questioned. The silence became part of their identity, a prison that reached deeper than the walls around them. Some tried to defy it. When one of the hikers ventured into the cellar, he found evidence of the rituals the journal had hinted at. There were rusted metal chains, remnants of animal bones mixed with human teeth, and jars of what looked like preserved organs, labeled with names that matched the ones scribbled in the old diary. The stench was unbearable, yet what disturbed them most was the sound they heard when they tried to leave, a faint dragging, followed by a low groan that came from somewhere beneath the floor. They ran before they could find out what it was. When authorities returned with a search team days later, the cabin was empty. The photographs were gone, the cellar sealed, and the forest unnervingly still. Only one thing remained, a single page from the journal lying on the porch, smeared with dirt and ash. On it were the words, "The blood must not be forgotten." After that, reports began to surface from locals who claimed to have seen figures moving through the woods at night, pale faces peeking from the trees, the faint glimmer of lantern light in places no one should be. The hikers never returned to that part of West Virginia, but their story spread like a curse, whispered in nearby towns as a warning about the family that refused to die, a family still keeping its silence beneath the roots of those cursed mountains. Years after the hikers' discovery, when most dismissed the story as local folklore, a young documentarian named Daniel Hurst arrived in the same region, determined to find proof of what really happened. He had grown up hearing stories about the Appalachian ghost family and believed that behind every myth there was a kernel of truth. His research led him to old census records showing a family line that appeared to vanish in the 1930s, no deaths reported, no migrations, just a sudden erasure. Daniel became obsessed, tracing the last known property deed to a forgotten area deep in the woods. It was the same location where the hikers once claimed to have found the cabin. Ignoring warnings from locals, he set out with a camera, a flashlight, and a notebook, intending to uncover the truth that everyone else had buried. The path to the site was barely visible, swallowed by decades of growth and decay. The air felt heavier the deeper he went, and there was an eerie stillness in the forest, as though every sound was being watched. When he reached the clearing, the cabin stood there exactly as the stories described, sagging under its own weight, covered in moss, its windows dark and hollow. Inside, time had stopped. Dust floated through beams of faint light, and the air smelled of iron and mold. He began filming. The footage recovered later ended abruptly. Authorities who searched the site found his camera half buried near the creek, still recording until its battery died. The cabin was gone, as though it had never existed. Daniel's body was never found, but locals still claim that sometimes, when the mist rolls through the valley, a faint voice can be heard echoing from the woods, the sound of a man whispering through static, repeating the same words over and over, "The blood remembers." Months after Daniel's disappearance, the footage he managed to capture spread across obscure corners of the internet, first as a mystery, then as a warning. The grainy video showed fragments of the cabin, the cellar walls painted in spirals, and flashes of figures that appeared for only a second before vanishing in static. Online investigators tried to enhance the footage, but each attempt only made the shapes more grotesque, less human. What caught everyone's attention was the final frame, a reflection in a cracked mirror showing Daniel's terrified face, and behind him, a faint silhouette of an old man with hollow eyes, staring directly at the camera. The image ignited chaos among true crime and paranormal communities, who dubbed the entity the grandfather. Some claimed it was proof of a generational curse, others insisted it was a hoax. But those who lived near the region didn't find it amusing. They said the face wasn't new, it had been seen before, long before cameras or internet theories. After the video went viral, strange reports began to surface from nearby towns. Hunters found mutilated animals arranged in circles deep in the forest. Locals heard chanting carried through the fog, though no one could ever find its source. One family claimed their youngest daughter had started speaking in her sleep, repeating phrases from Daniel's footage word for word, including the whisper, "The blood remembers." People began to avoid the valley altogether, calling it cursed land. Even law enforcement stopped investigating after 2 officers disappeared while searching for evidence. Their patrol car was discovered with the radio still crackling, the microphone swinging as though someone had just let go of it. Then came the fire. A massive blaze erupted one autumn night, consuming acres of forest and burning through what was once believed to be the old family's territory. Yet, when the flames died, the cabin's clearing was untouched, as if nature itself refused to destroy it. A group of firefighters who reached the area later reported seeing shapes moving through the smoke, gaunt figures with blank expressions and skin pale as ash. When questioned afterward, their stories were inconsistent, but every one of them mentioned seeing an old man standing by a lantern, his face half hidden, his eyes hollow and unblinking. After that, the government sealed off the forest, citing environmental hazards, though locals whispered it was to contain something much older and darker. The footage was quietly scrubbed from major platforms, but new clips kept reappearing, distorted and incomplete. In each one, the same voice could be heard faintly beneath the static, an old man's rasping whisper, almost pleading, almost proud, saying, "They still carry my name." Years later, when the story of the cursed bloodline had almost faded into a local legend, a research team from a small Virginia university stumbled upon a strange genetic anomaly while studying hereditary disorders in isolated communities. Their samples were collected from patients in rural medical clinics scattered across the Appalachian region. At first, the data seemed random, but as the results began to connect, one researcher noticed something unsettling: a recurring genetic marker that didn't appear in any known lineage, one that could be traced geographically to a specific area in West Virginia. The team didn't understand what they had found until they overlaid their data on an old regional map and realized that the marker formed a pattern, a perfect circle around the same stretch of forest where Daniel Hurst had vanished years earlier. At first, they dismissed it as coincidence, the kind of statistical fluke that sometimes appears in closed populations. But when they started reaching out to the families who carried the marker, they encountered an eerie silence. Some refused to speak. Others denied knowing their ancestry at all. One elderly woman, after being shown her results, reportedly whispered, "We were told never to talk about them," before abruptly leaving the room. The deeper the researchers dug, the stranger things became. Hospital records had been altered or destroyed, birth certificates erased, and one by one, the team's files began disappearing from their lab system. Then one of the lead geneticists went missing, leaving behind only a note that read, "They're not gone, they're hidden among us." In the weeks that followed, the surviving researchers began to notice strange events around their campus: figures standing just beyond the tree line, whispering voices on the wind, and a foul odor like smoke and iron. Security footage later showed someone entering the lab at night, though the figure's face was never captured clearly. By morning, the entire database of genetic samples had been wiped clean. The project was officially shut down, and the university quietly sealed its findings, citing unreliable data. But rumors spread among students that one of the researchers had kept a single vial, labeled only with the word bloodline. Some say that vial still circulates in the black market, traded among collectors of cursed relics. Others claim it was buried deep in the mountains where it came from, sealed in a box of salt and ash to keep it from awakening whatever was left of that family. But in the nearby towns, strange births have begun again, children with the same pale skin, the same dark eyes, and the same unshakable fear of mirrors. The locals whisper that the bloodline never truly ended, it simply learned how to survive in silence, just as it always had.